Hi, my name is Jacob Cypress, and this is my content analysis project on the TV show Landman, an analysis of how violence is used in the narrative of media and what messages this might send to viewers. The show I selected for this project is Landman, a drama series released in 2024 on Paramount Plus and created by Taylor Sheridan. The show is set in the West Texas oil fields and follows the lives of land negotiators, oil workers, and corporate executives as they deal with the high-stake deals, personal debates, and unstable social situations. Even though the show is mainly intended for adults, it's very accessible to older teens through streaming platforms. Its intense visuals, emotional drama, and portrayals of masculine characters making it appealing to adolescent viewers and relevant for studying how violence is presented and possibly becoming normalized. Previous research shows that violent media can seriously affect how young people think and behave. Anderson and colleagues in 2003 found that regular exposure to violent content can increase behavior, lower empathy, and negatively affect emotional development, especially in adolescence. Coyne and colleagues in 2016 also pointed out that when aggression is shown in male-dominated environments, it sends the message that being aggressive or emotionally distant is part of being a man. These studies help explain why a show like Landman, which often connects violence to masculinity and labor, matters for analysis. The purpose of this study is to analyze how violence appears in Landman, how often it shows up, and what it looks like. I'm also examining who commits the violence, how it's portrayed, and whether there are consequences or not. This helps us understand how violence connects to characters' roles and power within the story. My study is guided by 5 research questions focused on the form, type, impact, and source of violence in the show. Number 1 being how many times per episode was violence portrayed? Number 2, is the violence shown visually or said verbally? Number 3, what type of violence appears the most? Number 4, are the consequences for violent acts? And number 5, who commits the violence and who is targeted? Based on this research and the questions I have created, I developed 5 hypotheses. I expect to find at least 5 acts of violence per episode. My second hypothesis being visual violence like fights or visible injuries being the most common. My third is I believe that physical violence will likely be more frequent than verbal threats. Number 4, most violent acts won't lead to real consequences. And number 5, I think men in position of authority will commit most of the violence, while the victims are probably going to be outsiders or people with less power. Next up is the operational definitions and the coding scheme. The general definition of violence is defined as any action or behavior, whether physical or verbal, intended to cause harm, intimidate, threaten, or injure another character. This includes, but is not limited to, fistfights, slapping, kicking, weapon use, physical restraint, injuries from unsafe conditions, and verbal threats. Background noise or imagery, like explosions or yelling, will only be coded if they are narratively relevant and can be clearly depicted. The first subcategory variable, type of violence, will classify each incident as physical, for example, fighting or hitting, verbal, for example, threats or intimidation, or implied, off-screens, sounds, aftermath scenes. The second variable, mode of portrayal, identifies whether the violent act is shown visually, described verbally, or both. The third variable, consequences, records whether the violence leads to physical harm, like injury or death, legal outcomes, like arrest or police involvement, or social consequences, loss of status, relationships, or trust, or there might be no consequence at all. The fourth variable is the occupation of the perpetrator. This will track whether the character committing the violent act and characterize them into three occupational roles: oil worker, like a roughneck or a field laborer; executive or manager, like a landman or a corporate figure; or an outsider, an activist, criminal, local resident, or government agent. The final category enables the study to explore whether violence is associated with class, position, authority, or physical labor. These definitions and categories help create a clear and organized way to study violence in Landman. The goal is not to just count how often violence happens, but also to understand what it means in the story and how it might affect how viewers think about things like power, masculinity, and fairness. Next are my 3 coding sheets. I did 3 episodes of Landman. Here's episode 1, titled Landman. I did episode 3, titled Hell Has a Front Yard. And I did episode 6, Beware the Second Beating. Now for the results. For hypothesis 1, I predicted that there would be 5 or more instances of violence per episode. This hypothesis was supported, as the results showed episode 1 was the closest out of the 3, with exactly 5. Episode 3 had 7 instances, and episode 6 had 9. My second hypothesis was that I predicted that visual violence would be more commonly shown compared to having more verbal attacks. As seen on the right, this hypothesis was supported, and based on the research and the data, 71.43% acts of violence were shown visually, 23.8% were described verbally, and 4.6% were both visual and verbal. For my third hypothesis, I predicted that physical violence would be the most frequent, followed by verbal threats, and this hypothesis was supported. From the data, it shows that out of the 21 acts of violence through the 3 episodes, 15 were physical rather than verbal or implied off screen that make up the other 6 acts. My fourth hypothesis was that my prediction is that most violence committed will have no meaningful consequences. This hypothesis was not supported. According to the data, most acts of violence resulted in some sort of physical harm, like injury or death. My last hypothesis was that male characters in power roles will commit the most violence. As you can see again on the right, this hypothesis was not supported. Data reports that 42% of the acts committed were by oil workers, and the executives and managers were in a close second by 38%, while outsiders only committed a small 20%. Messages from the show. Landman shows more than one message about violence. Sometimes violence looks like the normal or expected way to solve problems, especially in tough jobs. Other times, it seems to have serious emotional or physical consequences. Because of this, teams might get mixed signals. Is violence okay? Is it harmful? Teens decide what to believe based on things like their own values, friends, and how much they understand media. They may not even realize they're being influenced. A character they like uses violence and gets respect. That can stick with them. But if they have strong role models or media literacy, they might question what they see. How can messages affect adolescents? Teens are still growing and figuring out who they are, how to handle emotions, and how to deal with others. Because their brains are still developing, especially the part that controls judgment and thinking ahead, They're more likely to be influenced by what they see on screen. If a show like Landman makes violence look cool or powerful, teens might take that in more easily. They may not think deeply about the long-term consequences because they're more focused on the action or emotion in the moment. One thing that I was pretty surprised about was that most of the violent scenes didn't lead to any real consequences, like people losing their jobs or getting arrested. It didn't happen really at all. Violence was kind of just accepted as part of the environment. This leads us to what can parents and people that work with the youth do? Educators, parents, and other caregivers must work together to develop children's and adolescents' literacy skills to be healthy, safe, and productive. Monitoring what they can watch may help decrease the chance of getting them onto bad media. It doesn't mean that parents have to watch media with them, but even just checking in on them every once in a while just to make sure they're still watching what they're supposed to helps a lot. This leads us to what can parents and people that work with the youth do? Educators, parents, and other caregivers must work together to develop children's and adolescents' literacy skills to be healthy, safe, and productive. Monitoring what they can watch may help decrease the chance of getting them onto bad media. It doesn't mean that parents have to watch media with them, but even just checking in on them every once in a while just to make sure they're still watching what they're supposed to helps a lot. In the media violence and its impact on youth, Janine Dominguez talks about how keeping these adolescents talking and continuing to have ongoing conversations with them has been proven to help kids get pulled into much easier media that's more relative with the world. That is it for my project. Thank you for listening.